All right. So introduce on you. Interesting. Perfect. So I'm going to quick.
Hi. Hey, hello.
All right, we're just about ready to start.
Hello. Say hi. I'm a little grumpy.
All right, thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to have you all here today. Really appreciative of you taking the time to come celebrate Lindon Barrett's legacy with us. Celebrate a new colleague and the legacy of Lindon Barrett, Donald Serrate. This is an event that we do to commemorate a colleague who passed away back in 2008, I believe. We still miss them very much. We miss their brilliance and their leadership, their sense of community, their collegiality. And so we're really, really pleased to be offering this event featuring new work in which that scholar pioneered, Lindon Barrett. I'd first like to introduce my colleague, Vorris Nunley, who will give us a sense of the context for the Lindon Barrett Award and the Lindon Barrett Talk. And then we'll come back and introduce Donald Serrate, this year's award winner, and look forward to his talk.
Hi. No, want that.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. To put it out, I want to put this in a little bit of a context. Today, in the midst of fascist turmoil and optimistic refusal, I think much about London and the Paul Laurence Dunbar poem, We Wear the Mask. We wear the mask that grins and lies, hides our cheeks and it shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, the torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouths with myriad subtleties. We wear the mask. Poet Kevin Young referred to this poem as a good poem. For Young, bad poetry describes, good poetry acts. Lindon possessed a charming laugh, an impish grin, but one that did not lie. One that did not convey to the world that he would obey in advance. His grin enacted his way of being in the world. It was simultaneously one of refusal and of joy. Queer joy and anti-Black refusal. This is precisely why, informed by those who participated, this is precisely why, and he was informed by those who participated the maroonage of the enslavement, which is exactly why, according to his words, he escaped the plantation of UCI. And in his words, and remember, this is from a guy who was brilliant. His words to me, he was glad to get the hell out of that fucking place. So he might survive, thrive, and live a Black queer life beyond measure, informed by his existence here in UCR's Department of English. To put this in context, why UCR's Department of English? English was and remains open, innovative, and a productively prickly space anchored in politically relevant and culturally attuned. This is so due to colleagues such as professors, some of them who are not here today with us, Catherine McKinney, James Tobias, Trish Yamamoto, who is the primary reason Lindon's existence and legacy can be remembered to be honored. Without him, without that, we wouldn't be here. John Gannam, Doris Haggerty, Kara Ann Tyler, Jennifer Doyle, and others without whom there would be no talk because Lindon would have gone elsewhere. Lindon was caring, empathetic, compassionate, but without cloying, self-effacing sentimentality. If Lindon did not like someone or their politics, he let you know, vehemently let you know. Lindon was productively dangerous. He did not suffer fools or the adjacent anti-Black, anti-queer foolishness. He did not put up with it. He was progressive without ego, committed without virtue signaling, compassionate without thank God, being nice in a manner that was too often expected of Black queer folks. Lindon had swag. He was vital in love and lively. He took up space. He demanded that folks take him into account. And of course, that included yours truly. So here we go. Lindon took it upon himself to plan party at his place. All of us for whom he cared were invited. However, there was one small caveat. There would be a runway, an actual runway. And I was required, according to him, to stroll down this runway in a damn dress. Then Lindon wear my ass out, telling me the style and the color of the dress he would wear. He would sashay down the ramp and loudly say to me, what's going to be the color of your dress? How are you going to walk? Right? He got on my last damn nerves and I loved him for it. He knew I would show. The question was how. Unfortunately, the event never happened. I wish it had. I would have been better for it. Lindon's thinking deep in mind. His depth of commitment strengthened me. His courage supported and affirmed my own. His existence made my own more meaningful and vibrant unto myself. And is in the spirit of today's talk, he brought the everyday. Everyday queerness, everyday Blackness, everyday Black queer refusal and joy. He brought that joy into the department's life and into my own. Lindon was a good poet. He enacted his spirit, his ontology, his vibe. He imagined and he lived otherwise. He refused to wear the mask.
Thank you, Vorris. That was beautiful, well said, and definitely resonant with, I think, the experience of so many of us, department and on campus. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Donald Zarate, the 24-25 winner of the Lindon Barrett Award in Black Studies. Donald Zarate is a third-year PhD student in political science here at UCR, specializing in political theory. His research focuses on utopianism and intentional communities, exploring how everyday normative beliefs shape political behavior. Donald earned his bachelor's degrees in political science and psychology from UCR after transferring from Norco College, where he completed associate degrees across natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. His recent article, From Exclusion to Utopia, a comparative study of intentional community formation, appeared in Political Research Quarterly, a leading journal in the field of political science. He's also been featured in UCR's Bold Hearts, Brilliant Minds campaign, semi-finalist in the 2024 Grand Slam competition, and his academic achievements have been recognized with the Dean's Distinguished Fellowship, the Humane Society Studies Fellowship, and the College Core Education Award. Donald serves as chapter mentor for Pi Sigma Alpha and has volunteered with UCR's program to support higher education for incarcerated students. He's also served more than 10 years in the U.S. Army, currently holding the rank of Staff Sergeant. He hopes to complete his PhD, commissioned through ROTC, and pursue a research career teaching at West Point. Please welcome, if you will, Donald Zarate.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I get into the substance of this talk, I want to begin with something more personal. When I first saw the call for submissions for the Lindon Barrett Black Studies Prize in March, I realized I didn't really know much about Professor Barrett himself. So I decided to do some research, and I have to say, even with the talk we've had here so far, the more I learn about him, the more I feel just stunned by the depth and breadth of his work. His generosity, his fearlessness, his absolute brilliance, his ability to weave together African American literature, critical theory, cultural studies, philosophy, and epistemology was simply extraordinary. What really resonated with me, though, and ultimately shaped my decision to submit my paper, was how closely his legacy aligns with the questions I'm wrestling with in my own work. Questions about the everyday, about imagination under constraint, and the way Black life enacts possibilities in the present. Professor Barrett navigated multiple terrains at once: literary, theoretical, philosophical, and historical, and I'm humbled that my work is being read in conversation with his name. So I want to thank you for sharing this space with me today. Now, this talk is drawn from the paper I presented, but I'm preparing it for submission to the Journal for Utopian Studies, so the framing is going to be slightly different. The title of this talk is Here and Now, Beyond Anti-Utopianism and Towards Quotidian Utopia. In my paper, I critiqued how utopia has been theorized by bridging these frameworks into conversation with Black geographies. But this talk makes a broader claim that these insights derived from Black utopia and the quotidian are examined beyond any single community. I illuminate how any group or person living outside the mainstream enact forms of utopia here and now, in the present, in the everyday. Ultimately, this is what I call living otherwise. Now, before I get ahead of myself, let me take a step back and ask you to think for a moment. And I'm going to invite you to actually do this. What comes to mind when I say the word utopia? Take a few seconds, think of the first image, feeling, or concept that surfaces when I say the word utopia.
Place and no place.
Alas. Ursula.
So chances are many of you started thinking of a perfect country, maybe a no place or a good place or some combination. A mess of contradictions is kind of the point. But whatever the case, this is the standard model of utopian studies, what I call mainstream, depicted here. At the top is utopia with an E, which comes from the same root as euphoria, so that it literally means good place. Funny enough, utopia with a U actually means no place. Below utopia is what we call the status quo, which really only acts as a relative benchmark for reference. This is the way things are as we understand them. The world as it is with all of its ugly, cruel messiness, but also its beauty and potential. Below that is dystopia, or nightmare place, which acts as a warning against unrestrained dreaming, sort of this is how bad things can actually get. Next to that is anti-utopia, with a dash, which also acts as a warning, but this one is more like a be careful what you wish for. Yet these are hardly the worst. At the bottom is anti-utopia, without the dash, which doesn't even offer a warning. It says, trying will only make things worse, so don't even do that. Despite their differences, all of these follow the same basic idea, that utopia is an expression of a desire for a better way of being. What's interesting about this mainstream conception of utopia is that there's a growing consensus that the spirit of utopia, that is, the almost unapologetic optimism that tends to accompany such visions of the future, is dying. People nowadays seem more inclined than ever to just accept things the way that they are, to follow the status quo without question. In other words, nowadays few children grow up actually believing that they can make the world a better place. In utopian studies, this consensus has a name, Antiutopianism. It's a compelling argument, but it's only part of the story. And the reason I came to question it actually started by accident. Now, this part isn't in the paper, but let me share my train of thought. During my first year in my PhD program in fall 2023, I took Professor Desiree Malonis's course on theorizing the Black geographic in political science. Now, I never took any kind of class that centered on non-mainstream thought, let alone Black studies. But as a political theorist, I was very excited to learn something I knew less than nothing about. And I was quickly humbled. The way Black geographers theorized and the level of abstraction that somehow maintained coherence without feeling linear. It felt and continues to feel like a haze dream, where the author is leading me to some unknown direction, and though I have little idea what's really going on, I'm enjoying the journey, and the insights are incomparable. Through every text we read, from authors as diverse as Du Bois, Fanon, Sharp, Gilmore, and McKittrick, something that stood out to me was an implicit spirit of utopia, or what I call the utopian impulse. Every text had a clearly dystopian element, a recounting of the horrors of slavery, anti-Black racism, the legacies of colonialism, and so on. Yet they each ended with a call for something better, something living and breathing that was difficult to articulate. Yet they clearly expressed something utopian. As the course advanced, I recognized what came to be called the utopian impulse was imbued within the literature, but it didn't conform to traditional utopian terms, expressions of hope, liveliness, abstraction, and a deferred elsewhere or elsewhen. Traditionally, utopian texts depict a good place. That sounds almost like unreserved optimism, but this definitely doesn't fit because Fanon was very, very angry in The Wretched of the Earth. At the same time, every text recounted the horrors of colonialism, slavery, and anti-Blackness, but they weren't completely dystopian. A dystopian text tries to convince the reader that this is an aberration, that its existence is unacceptable. But these Black geographers were totally at peace with historical realities. They didn't question what happened, and they didn't spend much time wondering why. This is the whole point of Christina Sharp's In the Wake and her treatment of the afterlife of American chattel slavery. Even more jarring, an anti-utopian text, that is without the dash, would shriek at any effort to try to change things. Yet all of these texts signal hope, a lingering call for action to make the world a better place. This is precisely how Rashad Shabaz's Spatializing Blackness and Caroline Finney's Black Faces, White Spaces ended their studies, with a call for a radical rethinking of the relationship between space and power. So I wound up with a paradox. These texts, while clearly utopian in a substantive manner, did not fit into any utopian category. Now, this lacking of fit is itself not a problem, but it planted the seed of a suspicion I had. Basically, I started to consider whether there was something different about how the Black subject engages with the concept of utopia that utopian studies has yet to pick up on. Still, I was new to the field and couldn't quite make it out yet. Since that time, I've come to learn that this is because Black literature relies on a westernized conception of better, rooted in what I call the elsewhere and elsewhen dichotomy. Now, unfortunately, I can't reasonably give credit to everyone I cite in my paper during this talk, but I hope to walk you through the broadest strokes of my argument in the argument that utopia ought better to be conceived of as a negotiation between individual agents and institutional design. In this way, anti-utopia is where individuals lack agency, but agency itself is a subjective experience that depends more on personal perceptions rather than any kind of objective reality. To make this argument, I will situate the mainstream by showing how utopia is often framed as distant, abstractive, and inevitably out of reach. Then I will explore how Black communities enact utopia in daily life through creative realism, ontological mobility, and Black geographies to engage with what I call the otherwise. Finally, I will reconceptualize anti-utopianism by introducing the Black differential, which highlights the uneven distribution of agency across racialized experiences. By centering on the here and now, I hope to show that utopia is not a far-off dream, but a continual negotiation of possibility, a vision of better worlds enacted in the quotidian. Historically, scholars have described Black utopias by approaching them through mainstream mirrors of utopian forms. These usually look like Black nationalism, Afrofuturism, and literary visions of an improved society. Scholars highlight Sutton Griggs, Martin Delany, and even Du Bois. But this canonization frames Black utopia as a derivative, a reaction to exclusion rather than a distinct tradition. But this poses a problem. If Black utopias are merely utopias written by Black authors, then why are there so few Black utopias? Empirically, we know that there are about 250 Black utopian texts, but there are over 11,000 utopian texts in English alone. Yet to date, there's no satisfactory explanation beyond superficial accounts that Black writers are not interested in utopia, that Black writers are disillusioned and so do not believe utopia is possible, that Black writers are more interested in nonfiction or praxis. But these overlook entire fields of Black thought that I previously mentioned seem to imbue the spirit of utopia. Aaron Robertson captures the deeper point, which often gets overlooked. Utopia is, and I quote, the urge to act out alternatives to the constructive rhythm of our days. It is not necessarily a place, but an expression of faith. In other words, the Black subject, utopia is entirely different from traditional conceptions of the good place. What exactly this means takes a lot of concentration, so please bear with me as I try to articulate what I call the grammars of the otherwise. These were the questions and suspicions I had when I read Janya Brown's book, Black Utopias, Speculative Life and the Music of Other Worlds, where she calls for a reorientation of utopia towards a spatio-temporal fold within the here and now. Her claim was pretty direct. Utopia isn't waiting for tomorrow or some other distant place. It's enacted in the struggles of everyday life. Paget Henry's notion of creative realism helps us understand this epistemologically. European metaphysics often claim universality, grounded in abstraction and historical continuity, the kind of legacies of the behavioral turn and positivism. By contrast, African knowledge traditions, developed under slavery, imperialism, and ongoing racial oppression, treat identity and meaning as fluid, contingent, and remade through struggle. This is a very constructivist approach. In this framework, theorizing from the Black experience itself is utopian, not because it gestures towards an ideal, but because it transforms the world through reinterpretation. It's a radical defiance, a method that refuses to accept a positivist ontology that assumes a fixed reality, and instead insists on the legitimacy of alternative ways of knowing the universe. But if knowledge is fluid, and that's the epistemology that Brown draws on, the question becomes, why is there a distinction between Western and African knowledge production in the first place? What is it that makes the two subjects different? Well, this sets the foundation for Sylvia Wynters's conception of deselection. If we pause for a moment and think of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection, Sylvia Winters draws on survival of the fittest, where nature selects those fit for survival. Deselection is the realization that today's society, in today's time, society actually determines who's fit for survival by unselecting certain populations. The result is a propensity for premature death, especially premature Black death. But this isn't genocide, it's society, because society isn't really doing the killing. Instead, it's kind of a systematic neglect, premature death through structured abandonment and vulnerability instead of gas chambers and firing squads. It's important to note, though, as Johnny Brown emphasized, that this exclusion isn't unusual. It's built into modernity itself. This means that all the various forms of knowledge that we value, we as in us today in this room in the contemporary United States, often begin our search for knowledge with an assumption of shared humanity, that at the end of the day, at least we're all human. But this assumption makes us take certain things for granted, things which for most people seem perfectly natural and ordinary, but for others simply aren't. Take, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It opens with the line, all human beings are born free and equal with dignity and respect. But when that document was drafted in 1948, 2/3 of Africa was under European colonial rule. Jim Crow segregation was fully enacted in the United States, and Black people were routinely denied political, social, and economic personhood. None of this is even to say that much has very much changed, but the point stands. In other words, the world declared universal humanity at the precise moment when Black life was globally treated as something other than human. It is easy to dismiss these things as merely mistakes or even lies or historical differences, but I take the position, like Sylvia Wynter, that they are illustrative of the things that come to mind when we think of the term human or even people. The fact of the matter is this: the category human just has never really included Black perspectives. This exclusion becomes especially visible when we turn to the question of space. As Black geographers like Catherine McKittrick argued, space is never neutral. It's produced through histories and systems of domination. In this way, anti-Blackness is not only social or economic, it is spatial. It marks Black people as perpetually out of place, prescribing where Black bodies can appear, how they move, and what kind of spatial practices are legitimate or even intelligible. At the same time, the very spaces that are shaped by domination can also be sites of resistance. McKittrick's reading of Harriet Jacobs is one of the clearest illustrations of this. Jacobs, fleeing sexual violence under chattel slavery, hid for 7 years in a tiny crawl space above her grandmother's porch, a garret so small she could neither stand upright nor fully stretch her limbs. The space was suffocating, unbearably hot in the summer, freezing in winter, and physically debilitating. Yet her decision to occupy this space, again for 7 years, reveals the paradoxical nature of Black spatiality. By hiding in place rather than fleeing north, Jacobs transformed a zone of extreme confinement into a strategy of refusal. She was simultaneously contained and liberated, free from her enslaver's control, precisely because she chose to remain in a space that was never meant to be inhabited. To give you an idea, I have 2 images worth sharing in detail. The first depicts the view that Harriet would see from her garret and her revived spirits when spring came. Every year, she explained, and I quote, "The beautiful spring came, and when nature resumes her loveliness, the human soul is apt to revive also. My drooping hopes came to life again with the flowers." Yet at the same time, she was hiding in a garret, one that would look very much like this. She was contorted, confined, and yet this was all voluntary, because holding herself in this kind of captivity was somehow better more desirable than the alternative, which is to say that it was really painful. Black geographies teach us that the material world is saturated with domination, but it is also a generator of alternative possibilities within the cracks and constraints of everyday environments, like a simple garret. Places of survival, improvisation, and quiet world-making can emerge. Practices that are utopian in their insistence that life can be lived otherwise, even in conditions designed to prevent it. While this exclusion is devastating, it also produces what Brown called the ontological mobility, a capacity to perceive and interpret the world through multiple, often contradictory frames. Rather than being locked into a single worldview, Black subjects are compelled by history, by violence, by survival, to develop alternative ways of seeing. This is what distinguishes Black utopianism from its mainstream counterpart. Mainstream utopianism is organized around achievement and progress, a kind of gradualism that begins from a stable present where one can imagine and strive for a better future. It follows what we might call an investment model of politics. If things can improve, then it makes sense to invest in political structures to make that improvement happen. For the Black tradition, shaped by captivity, displacement, and persistent anti-Blackness, such stability is an illusion. If the present is already defined by precarity, if one's life, movement, and future is never really guaranteed, then investing in politics as a pathway to better becomes mere nonsense. How can one invest in a future that they'll never actually reach? In these conditions, improvement must emerge from somewhere other than the formal political sphere. Politics itself becomes a non-starter. Of course, this isn't the whole story, though. Many figures in the Black tradition, Du Bois being a prominent example, did invest hope in political transformation. This, however, is precisely what Brown means by ontological mobility. Not simply that Black subjects see the world differently, but that they can hold and navigate multiple interpretive registers at once. They can treat politics as both necessary and insufficient, both a tool and an obstacle. The fluidity of this interpretation is itself a survival strategy. From this vantage point, utopia begins with the question of how to survive and even thrive within systems designed to limit or extinguish Black life. This is why Black utopian practice often emerges not in formal political theory, but in cultural production, music, spirituality, mysticism, Black power organizing, and the everyday work of world making. These are not marginal or derivative expressions of utopia. They constitute a parallel tradition grounded in distinct historical, political, and imaginative realities. Their absence in mainstream utopian studies reflects the field's narrow methodological assumptions, not their lack of significance. And while Brown frames ontological mobility as a specifically Black experience, there is no reason to assume it's exclusive. Other historically marginalized groups, those whose existence have been shaped by erasure, denial, and premature death, also generate unique ontologies. Crowley's notion of otherwise possibilities in the context of Indigenous politics shows how the practices of everyday care, creativity, and joy enact a form of utopia that does not aspire towards a different future, but can be felt and lived in the present. Taken together, Henry, Winter, McKintrick, and Brown articulate a counter-tradition of utopian thought, one grounded neither in progress nor futurity, but in persistence, a world-making practice that is both temporally and spatially present. Their combined insights make it clear that utopia is not an elusive elsewhere or elsewhen. It is already here, in the present, in the quotidian practices of refusal, in the ordinary acts of care, and in the creative struggle to craft livable worlds amid structures designed to deny life. Different subjects experience utopia and dystopia and the status quo in fundamentally different ways. A variation I term here the utopian differential. This concept maps the uneven distribution of hope, possibility, and agency across social positions. What appears as neutral or livable for one group may constitute dystopia for another. What one imagines as utopia might already be someone else's ongoing struggle. For the otherwise, those subjects marginalized or excluded by the mainstream, the utopian differential highlights how the logics that define the human fail to account for lived realities. When applied to the Black subject, this is what I call the Black differential. What appears as incremental improvement or mere survival for one, for the otherwise signify profound resistance or transformation. In other words, there is an implicit acknowledgement that the status quo itself is already dystopian, structured by systemic negation, exclusion, and what Sexton referred to as the politics of despair. When this general framework is applied, it becomes the Black differential depicted on the slide. Under conditions shaped by slavery, colonialism, and racialized categories, the spatio-temporal order that structures mainstream utopianism is merely constraining. It is fundamentally non-synchronous. Utopia with an E, then, manifests as a mode of survival found in the Black fantastic, which includes, and I quote Crawley, the quotidian ordinary and everyday nature of those violent incidents which produce within us a restiveness, a restlessness, a desire to exist otherwise. It's the violence that is the daily experience of the Black flesh, against which those of us committed to justice must contend. Dystopia, rather than being a distant threat, is a present reality, a framework emphasized with Afro-pessimism, and, as I quote, unflinching critique of human capacity rather than a critique of unethical or discriminatory acts. These are not escapes, but are interventions, ways of inhabiting the present and asserting agency through negation with the ordinary. In this sense, the Black differential demonstrates that utopia is not a fixed or universal category, but a relational experience shaped by historical, social, and ontological positions. Now I want to reframe anti-utopia, which I'll do by asking you again to take a moment and engage in a brief thought experiment. Again, I invite you to actually do this. Close your eyes and consider what comes to mind when I say the word tree. Take a few seconds, think of the first image, feeling, or concept that surfaces, and really focus on it. What exactly do you see with your eyes as they're closed? How would you describe it? What are its notable features? Now, you may be thinking of a classic oak, or a birch tree, or a redwood, or many of the variety that exist. Maybe you picture something picture perfect, or maybe you really just pulled from one of your memories, or maybe you just pictured a prototypical tree, a phantom, non-existing, cartoonish type tree, like the one you see here. Whatever you picture, your brain is using a mental shortcut, a prototype, to compare what you see with what you expect. When you see this tree here, and compare it against your own conception of a tree, you're engaging what I call mental contrasting. But remember, this isn't about trees. I argue the same process shapes how we think about politics. We compare the world as it is to how we believe it should be. This conception is what I think captures utopia, one that acknowledges it as a relational concept, highlighting perceived agency across subjective experiences. As my premise, I take utopianism to be ultimately a motivational concept. In a very general sense, if utopia captures a person's individual conception, then that conception serves as an object to guide behavior, shape attention, interpretation, and responses. Utopia in this sense is just a goal. In everyday life, this is how people navigate social worlds, implicitly or explicitly assessing where reality diverges from their ideal and then deciding how to respond. These decisions lead to the three functions of utopia: critique, change, and compensation. Critique arises from perceived injustice. Change comes from the belief that one can close the gap between their ideal and reality. And compensation, or escape, arises when change seems impossible, or just simply not worth it. In this sense, utopia and dystopia operate as motivators. Dreams of a better world encourage radical change, while fear of oppression and collapse drives resistance and the defense of existing gains, mediated by how individuals conceive of that elusive good place. Crucially, these processes are not limited to articulated visions of a better future. Ordinary, everyday actions can embody utopian thinking. And this is what I call the quotidian utopia, the ongoing negotiation between one's ideal and one's reality acted out in daily life. This perspective reorientates anti-utopia as the perception of constrained or absent agency. Who possesses the capacity to act and how that capacity is exercised determines whether a narrative depicts hope or despair. In the mainstream, agency is frequently assumed. Anti-utopianism then dramatizes the loss. In dystopian media like The 100 or The Walking Dead, the shows depict negotiations as the protagonists seek to reclaim agency only after it has been threatened. More sinister shows like Elysium or Gattaca argue that agency never existed in the first place, and that is why they're so daunting. But in Black utopianism, agency is never guaranteed or even assumed. Instead, it needs to be asserted and enacted. Utopian works emerge less in mass media narratives than in forms that experiment, subvert, or transform the ordinary. In speculative art, ritual storytelling, embodied practices, mysticism, and unconventional models. These expressions often defy the formal logic of mainstream media, privileging imaginative and relational possibilities over plot-driven narratives. In this register, everyday practices of thinking, imagining, creating, and inhabiting the world otherwise become sites of power, persistence, and hope cultivated in the quotidian. This is as much an ontological claim as it is a social. The Black differential provides a conceptual bridge for understanding these dynamics and helping reorientate the concept of utopia itself. On top of utopia as content, form, and function, utopianism involves the conditions under which agency is realized, constrained, or foreclosed. Anti-utopia, then, is dystopia when agency is absent, while Black utopia is the enactment of agency despite structural absence of possibility. If you remember, this project began with pointing to a general consensus that utopian thinking is on the decline, that people are more inclined to accept things the way that they are than try to change them. This is anti-utopianism, and the claim is that utopia is under attack. But this approach does more than refine the conceptual vocabulary of utopia. It shifts the stakes of utopian scholarship. My paper argues that Black utopia is not marginal, derivative, or abstractly aspirational. It is a parallel tradition in its own right that insists on the inseparability of meaning, doing, imagining, theory, and survival. By focusing on the relational distribution of agency, utopians recognize that utopia is already here in acts of care, improvisation, creative production, and the persistent assertion that one's presence and possibility in worlds that seek to deny it. The implications ripple outwards. They invite scholars to engage with global, diasporic, and indigenous practices that similarly enact utopia under constraint without relying on an elsewhere or elsewhen dichotomy. They suggest empirical approaches that attend to the subtle, cumulative, and often invisible works of living otherwise. And they demand scholars reconsider what counts as evidence for utopian practice, expanding it beyond content, form, and function to include the material, imaginative labors through which life is continually remade. They also introduce the foundations for a utopian theory of politics. Utopia is neither universal nor symmetrical, but relational and socially contingent, shaped by historical structures and ontological positions. This perspective clarifies why Black utopian literature is often scarce in canonical collections, not because Black utopians are far and few in between, but because their forms do not conform to dominant expectations. Attending to these realities allows scholars to recognize and theorize a parallel tradition of world-making. Ultimately, reconceptualizing utopia around agency, relationality, and positionality helps explain why Black utopia matters not only for those historically excluded, but also for utopian thought itself. It shows that imagining other worlds is inseparable from the work of negotiating constrained realities. By revealing the interplay of structure, action, and possibility, the Black differential demonstrates that utopia is already enacted here in the here and now, and that quotidian is the site of possibility, that the structure of life made livable under constraint is itself the most profound articulation of what it means to hope. This perspective moves us beyond the elsewhere-elsewhen dichotomy, beyond anti-utopianism, and towards a conception of the quotidian utopia in which the work of world-making is embedded in everyday acts of survival. Thank you.
See right there, we'd love to have a round of questions and comments if we can. Do we have questions or comments from the audience?
Thank you. This was wonderful. And I think entirely accurate. I'm wondering about some of the other texts that you are insights that you were thinking through to arrive here. I know you talked a little bit about Harriet Jacobs sort of imagining and dreaming, living, and otherwise, even from within the garret. But are there other texts in particular that are, or sites, you know, I could think of a lot of them, but like, are there any other ones that are sort of informing this theorization of Black Utopia?
So most of my familiarity comes from the Black geography. So Ruth Gilmore, Angela Davis, Frantz Fanon, Foucault, lots of theorists that theorize about geography and the relationality between space. As far as physical sites, locations, when I say quotidian, like this really, I can't stress enough when I mean every day, I literally mean the everyday. So like the classroom, the bedroom, down the street. So
Porch.
yeah, just anywhere and everywhere. And so the point that I'm trying to draw out is that in mainstream utopianism, the idea is that you can make the world a better place in the future, or if you go somewhere else. But for the Black utopian, the idea is you can do it anywhere. There's no reason to wait. It could be here, it could be over there, it doesn't matter. Just do it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. I know, but it applies because I was thinking like, oh, the drum circle, the kitchen table, you know, like I could think of so many. So I just wanted to know if there was something specific that was sort of lighting this up for you. But yeah, thank you. Thank you for your
on those lines, the most specific ones that would connect with that is Rashad Shabaz's Spatializing Blackness. He goes into a deep study of kitchenettes in Chicago during the 1900s. There's a lot to unpack there, so please just check it out. But kitchenettes are a good example.
Other questions or comments? Vorris.
Good job. So who's that? There's a lot we could talk about. I want to begin with that because I was certainly waiting with bated breath to see what you needed to do. So that said, we're talking about how this utopic blackness addresses the political, but also metaphysical. Chapter 7 in Teddy Robinson's Black Marxism supports your contention. Actually, the struggle to which you allude is more metaphysical than it is political. So I think that feeds what you're trying to do. And often in Black study, people overlook that and they make it about Marxism, but so you're onto something there, okay? You're dealing with ontology. Be careful there. Because it's such a weighted subject and it's so theoretically dense that you want to, in your writing, say that when you're dealing with ontology, you're addressing this. For example, your work runs parallel to what Naeem Chandler, Marquise Bay, who was a theorist, queer theorist, and Fred Moulton called para-ontology. And you want to be aware of that, whether you address it or not. You might want to footnote it. So you can say that I'm excited about your project. So I'm telling you, I'm not saying what you haven't done. I'm actually telling you to push your work even further. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. As a political theorist in training, that's like what'll make or break a theorist. So this isn't to say I've done it satisfactory, but it's good to have it flagged. But thank you.
Yeah, so look at this as this is not a kind of This occurs too often in the academy. This is not, what's the word I'm looking for?
Critique.
Huh?
Gatekeeping.
Thank you. It's not gatekeeping. This is building upon what you're already doing.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Okay. And so so one other thing, we want to be careful when we talk about Black utopianism, not addressing particular issues. But actually, if you think about Afrofuturism and, for example, Prayer of the Solar, Lord actually says, points toward the future, toward the stars. She doesn't talk about staying here. She talks about other kind of possibilities. But what I think about your work is that's so productive is that it's grounded in the Quotidian. However, so that being said, you made a comment about, well, let me say it another way. You want to make sure that your statements are measured.
Mhm.
So you don't have someone sitting in the back like me saying, okay, I want to jump on this. I don't want that. So the overall argument, strong, solid. What I'm trying to do is help you build upon it and remember that in Afrofuturism, there are a lot of folks who write for Black futurity,
Mhm.
et cetera, but you're trying to do something else.
Yeah.
Productive.
To that point, I'm trying to say that that exists and is already recognized by the utopian canon, but there's so much more that isn't recognized that has that same spark that what is recognized has.
I don't disagree.
Other comments or questions? Yeah, Jolandra.
There was a part where you said something about agency and like the differences between how like Black subjects approach agency. And I was very much with you. I don't remember exactly what it was, but do we need agency at all? You know, I don't know. Just when I think about agency, I think about there's something very like humanist in the idea of like agency. And one of the things that Jana, who was my advisor,
Really?
yes. So one of the things that she was arguing was for a completely like that Black utopianism, Black speculation. It offers a way of being that's completely outside of, beyond, not even in conversation with the human. And I feel like the idea of like a sort of an individualist agency is kind of caught up in the human a bit. So I agree with you that agency isn't like, you can't assume agency, like the Black subject can't assume it. But in these kind of quotidian practices you're talking about, is agency even a goal? Because the kinds of things I found myself thinking about while you were talking about Black utopia are moments where we really melt into each other. You know, I think about like the drum circle. I think about the Black girl like song and dance games when we're in the cipher. Like all of the things that were coming to my mind as you were speaking are moments that I feel like they're not about agency. They're about community and exchange and the kind of energy where the individual doesn't matter anymore. So, you know, just.
Well, I love that because you brought to the front a little tension that I was feeling in that, because if the goal is, if agency is beside the point, then why bring it back in? And I think you've helped me articulate it. It isn't that agency is a goal or even that it's acknowledged, but as an outsider looking in, that's what's happening, that there is agency. Put differently, in psychology, there's a concept called locus of control, which is how a person feels like they can control their environment. Not control in like a masterfully puppetal kind of way, but in just a like, I have the ability to lift this. Like very, very literal sense of I can do that. And so what I'm getting at is more on that sense, that when an agent exercises a perceived ability to do things in a very literal sense, that's the level of agency I'm talking about. So again, you've brought out what I've been struggling with. So I hope to articulate that more clearly in the next version of my paper.
I encourage you to think about how that the ability I can do things in my environment, how that's informed by we, because that's a very core element of Black experience. And the kind of moments, like Harriet Jacobs stays in that garret because of we, like she stays there because of her children, right? She stays there because of her family. Otherwise, she just could have ran away, right? So like, how is that the ability, that ability to, I can do things, but often in Black thought and experience, it's not about I can do things.
Right. And that's part of the reason why I really enjoy this topic, because this makes me think of Sun Ra in Brown's Black Utopias, in her discussion on his philosophy of being one with the cosmos. And it's like, full disclosure, that half of that goes over my head. So I'm still grappling with it. So I'm really excited to, as you say, to consider that. I'm going to be really wrestling with it.
Yeah, no, I think it's beautiful. I think what you're doing is so beautiful. Maybe it's ontology, right? Like there's something about the beingness of Blackness that I think, I'll stop there. You're good.
Thank you. That was really, really wonderful. And I really also appreciate the discussion and comments. I was just curious in philosophy, theory, if you've come across other paradigms, a sense of, I don't know if it's immanence, but it's a potentiality in the now, in the quotidian, because I wonder that. And I wonder some of those, within political theory, continental thinking or something. But I was thinking about Jose Munoz.
Cruising Utopia?
Yeah, Cruising Utopia, because he's also in where that intersects, or how it intersects at all, in terms of his attention to the quotidian, the club, the everyday becoming that.
So that, unfortunately, I haven't read the text yet, but I've read, like, he's cited so often in so many other studies. I have the book. I haven't gotten to it yet. But the way people talk about Munoz's theories is what made me want to expand this to be more of an otherwise conception, rather than, I don't want to say just the Black experience, because that's a whole thing that is in its own right. But that I feel like there's some, in utopian studies, I need to caution that this is limited to utopian studies, not knowledge production in general. But in utopian studies, there's the mainstream conception that, like, this is how utopia functions. And there are other considerations of the everyday utopia. But those versions of the everyday, and they use the term everyday, they don't use the term quotidian. Their versions of the everyday are more about, like, what government and society does as a whole to encourage the everyday. So, for example, enacting certain practices in the classroom, or family structures, or changing marriage, the legal system, those are everyday in the fact that everyone engages with them on an everyday basis, but they're not quite as close to home as what I'm trying to argue. And so to your question about, I maybe changed your question a little, my apologies, but to your bringing up of Munoz and queer utopias, that is closer to what I'm getting at of an otherwise, that there's something broader going on that doesn't fit the current conception of utopia in mainstream utopian studies.
They are on leave right now, but in the winter, make sure you go see Professor Elise Ambrose. She does work in religion and in queer theory, and they are an expert in the beyond and the other worlds.
I think it doesn't specifically use the language for utopia, but something else I think is in conversation with your project is Richard Iden in The Search for Black Fantastic, because it's kind of, have you read that?
That is coming up. Like Munoz, that's coming up.
Yeah.
Come up.
No, it's okay, but I think it would be useful because of what you're arguing about politics, and like there being something outside of and beyond of like the formalized sphere of politics, that Black cultural production like registers, it can hold that like the formal civil society and those institutions can't. So that I think that would be helpful too, because that's basically what you're arguing.
Yeah, what's funny is the connection to the otherwise in the Black Fantastic is actually relatively recent. The paper I submitted in March, I had only connected to that vocabulary within a month of submitting.
Right.
So very fresh, and I've only recently hashed it out in the latest version. So I'll definitely be checking that out.
A question. On one hand, you're dealing with utopian narrative kind of very broadly, and then you're switching the focus away from kind of narrative and that problematic way in which we sometimes use this sleight of hand of allowing narrative to stand in for some putative historical progress. And you usefully kind of switch the focus to this idea that you're proposing, the Black differential. But in that, I think the utopian becomes a little bit more related to things like the gestural in addition to the spatial. And I'm really interested in this question that people have been bringing up about, how not to necessarily lose the idea of futurity, and how also to emphasize the importance of collectivity and collective enunciation. And so one question I have is, when you resituate utopia in that way towards the gestural and in a way towards the ethical, given the concerns you have about the problem of the ethical, how do you scale, or do you scale the habitus or the site of the utopian in everyday life?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that last part.
Yeah, so the question is, in your theory, how do you account for a moment of the utopian in a quotidian sense such that it not reproduces and be disseminated?
So like, how do we share the moment?
Share it, or make it last, or reinvent it and go on improvising it beyond essentially quotidian, or maybe across quotidian moments. So that's my question, and I would say that a lot of work that I've been doing with students in queer studies lately is, I ask them, how does someone who just has no agency very often, how do they engage in self-fashioning? Like, where do you, especially if you don't have a lot of economic resources, etc., connections, community that's not given at the outset. And I think that there's something to be said also for not only thinking about maybe futurity in a modified way, so that it's not, identified with a kind of naive notion of utopia. I think there's a way of kind of rethinking the relational and including a moment for the non-relational. And what I mean by that is this, I think also Jalandra is getting at something like this idea that maybe the self emerges not in terms of a normative idea of agency, but in terms of a non-relationality that coalesces in selfhood or personhood on the basis of the collective.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's useful at all, but I just thought I'd throw it out there.
It is, because for me, it's a good reminder that what I'm doing isn't exactly, it's not like I'm lifting up the hood and saying, here's Black Utopia. More what I'm doing is I'm taking Black Utopia as a language I don't know, and I'm transcribing it into an audience that doesn't recognize its even existence.
Mm-hmm.
And so both of you have brought out that there's a little bit lost in translation, which to some extent is unavoidable, but still important to flag, because me as the researcher going through this need to figure out the most critical points where that translation is most imperative, and to basically point it out that it's not exactly that way.
Thank you for your response.
Thank you for your question. I'm definitely going to be holding on to these.
Other comments or questions?
I just want to shout out to somebody in the English department you may know, Liza Wemacourt. She won the prize a couple of years ago, and she gave a paper really, and it's really interesting to think about disciplinary differences. And she was thinking about the speculative and something that's ongoing. So I just see a really, really wonderful conversation between those two winning
And what department was it?
English.
Wenaport?
Liza Wemacore.
Thank you.
Before we close, I thought that because it's a fairly vocal group, we should probably decloak and reveal ourselves.
Oh, say who we are.
Say who we are. Because you have actually experts in many of the things that you're interested in, and it would be nice for maybe future consultation. And just so you know, you've now been officially adopted by the English department. So, know me, I'm Jim Tobias. Maybe we could just go around the room. We'll start over there with Vorris.
Before I adopt you, how much do you eat every day?
He said, how much do you eat before he adopts you?
Oh, she knows that.
I need information. My name is Professor Vorris Nunley. I'm in both the English department and in Black Study.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carla Mazzio. I in the department.
Yeah, my name is Suyeon Kim. I'm the first year in the English department.
Grace Yamamoto, English department.
I don't look like it today because I'm in mom mode, but I also teach in the English department and I work on speculative fiction and Black studies.
So I'm completely on the outside of this. I'm got Sir Jim invited, and it's fascinating. I have to say, I'm part of I'm on the faculty in the medical school. I do biomedical sciences, and then it goes back to a lot of things we think about, but I really appreciate the completely different perspective, right? On this, so I can't speak to any of the literature that you all have been discussing, to be honest, and but I think in what you presented, I can see a lot of trains of thought that we encounter too, but in different contexts. But there is some commonality. So one of the main questions I come out of this, and this is a little bit maybe not that I want to challenge this, but I think I get a little bit the impression that you have right now two systems of utopianism, right, or basically in parallel, and it makes me wonder if there is something that would combine or unify that, because ultimately you would want to have we need to appreciate differences, right? But we would also, what prevents us from having combine this? Because by simply maybe rejecting why should someone not have the agency to think about this, right? This is not. I think you would not. And it comes back because actually we do look at this in the same way. If you look at the whole history of science, right? I mean, they're very similar because science has a lot to do with utopia, right? And with picking up history, right? And then understand, and often you to understand this, you also need to look at what has happened before, how, and a lot of this how people perceive it, right? And how people know. I mean, it's maybe here the same as in science. One of the biggest problems is dogma, right? And in order to and then this talk of like thinking out of the box, right? So this is a little bit along the lines, like, but you picked off some thoughts in there. So I really appreciate it. Very fascinating talk. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Over here.
Oh, Ricky Rodriguez. I'm in the English department.
My name is Camille Costa. I'm a second year undergrad, so I'm an English and philosophy double major, and I also happen to be the president of the English Majors Association. But I know we've spoken on email once. You have my personal information.
Ah,
It's because I was in moot court, so you asked for that from me, so I thought it was interesting. But yeah.
small world.
I'm Paul Denuri in political science.
Everyone, thank you so much for coming. A round of applause.
One more person. I'm Mom.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Yes. Not all of these. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you, Donald, so much. We really enjoyed your talk, and we're looking forward to the published version. Good luck with that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful.
Is that cool to see your son? Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
You invited me today. Yeah, I am too.
Anytime,
Yeah.
these folks,
You're doing remarkable
if
work.
you have any questions or
Very good.
ideas that you'd like to discuss, I'm sure they do that.
What we were actually discussed.
Yeah, really.
I
actually have one.
It's great that you came.
Thank you.
Anti-Utopianism, living without a hyphen. One of those strikes me as being